Okay, so my name is Jonny Rae Evans, and it's been pointed out to me, like more than once recently, that if you have no other data other than my name, like Jonny Rae Evans, someone said it sounds like, well, you sound like a cool, so you already know it's not true, cool 1950s trombone player from like a jazz band in New Orleans, right? And then you meet me, and it's just disappointing. Country and western singer even. I prefer the jazz player, if I'm honest. Yeah, so I apologise if it's the same situation. You've come here because of the name, and now you're like, what have we got into? But we're committed, we're going to go through it. And the pretentious title is Design, Death and Sex Workers. In the past, it's been Design, Death and Sex Workers without the parentheses, but because of the love honey talk, I had to sex it up a little bit. So I wrapped workers in brackets just for that. It's not sexy at all. So who am I? I am Head of Product Innovation at the Big Lottery Fund. I've only just started the job. Don't really know what that means yet. So I asked someone, what do we do? So I'm going to read some notes just while I explain what the Big Lottery Fund do, so I can't get it wrong. Okay, so the Big Lottery Fund uses money raised by national lottery players, and we help communities achieve their ambitions. Since 2004, we've awarded £8.5 billion to projects that improve the lives of millions of people. So there's no pressure for me there then. Before that, I was Head of Design and User Experience at a digital agency in Manchester. And I guess our USP there was we only worked on products that we felt had a positive social impact. So we're quite ruthless with who we would work with. That meant we worked with a lot of charities or a lot of not-for-profits or education, healthcare, and we made some of our own products, which I'm going to talk to you about because I don't really have much to talk about from the Big Lottery Fund because I've been there like 8 hours. I also co-founded an organisation called Tech for Good Live. So we release an event every month. It's in Manchester. If you're ever in Manchester, come along. It's quite fun. And that is aimed at people who work in tech and trying to encourage them to use their skills for good. And it's also aimed at the charity sector to try and encourage them to embrace technology. So we do an event every month on a different theme. Like this next month will be healthcare. And we do a podcast that was every month, and now we're going weekly. But I'm a designer, even though that isn't in my new job title. I've been doing it for quite a while. I weirdly went freelance first, it was in brand, then moved to UX for freelance for quite a while, moved around various in-house places and contracts. Then I went to an agency that made like really bad stuff, like good quality, but monstrous stuff that made the world worse. So all of those really horrible dark patterns that gambling companies do, that like driven people into poverty and death and despair. That was me, thank you very much. So then I went to the agency that does good to try and cleanse my soul, so I have a shot at getting into heaven. And now I've gone to a Big Lottery Fund that helps people who need it. And I was the cause of a lot of that, so I figured I get to fix it now, so that's quite good. A lot of what I'm going to talk to you about, I'm not allowed to show you because that will become clear. It's either under NDA or it's like a secret. It's a good job we're not being filmed and you've got access to Twitter. So I'm going to use my words to describe it, my beautiful words rather than visuals. But if you are unsure if I'm a designer, I have cats, which I think cats in a slide deck at Design Talk proves that you are one. This is Lilu. Yeah, she's getting a better reaction than my mum. I know, isn't she great? I have thousands of cats. I can't get them all in one photo, so yeah. I mean, they live with me, I don't live with them. It's not like in an alleyway, they're in my house. But yeah, a Christmas photo with a cat, a blanket, because I'm an old person and I've got slippers under there, and an interesting mix of Prosecco and Dr. Pepper. Because I'm classy like that. Yeah, so clearly a designer. But I'm not talking about cats, but I'm going to talk to you about sex workers. And it's safe for me to say, up until like a couple of years ago, my knowledge of the sex work industry was very limited. Not so much now. I did grow up, I'm like a city boy. I live in the country now, but I'm like a city boy until like the last year. So I would sometimes see sex workers around Piccadilly Station in Manchester if it was a late night train, or they're regularly represented in TV shows and movies, or you might see them on the news, which is usually like not a good, it's not going to be a positive story. But that was like my exposure to the world of sex work. It rarely comes up in conversation, For me personally, except now, I suppose. Yeah, and probably many of us haven't had like an in-depth conversation with a sex worker. Is that a fair assumption? Yeah, okay. Unless it's like, no, this is the one place you come and do a talk. I mean, of course, this is the one place you come and do a talk, Jonny, where everyone has had a conversation with a sex worker. So, to give you some stats, there's an estimated 80,000 sex workers in the UK. It's a larger industry than mining, for example. I mean, it is. But yeah, so some, numbers. So your exposure to sex workers is maybe from things like this. Newspaper reports, which are usually quite grim if you do see them. So this group of many, this is like a really fun follow to the sex toys talk, isn't it? So sorry to like bum everyone out. Does it get better? Does it? No, there's like a nice heartwarming story right at the end before you prefer roles. Okay, so this group are many more times to be the victim of a violent crime like rape, murder or assault than you or I. And they struggle to confide in the police and members of the public for obvious reasons, and they struggle to use traditional support channels as well. So you'll see headlines like this sometimes, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. The really high-profile press stories that will read well or have great headlines. But if you just do the briefest amount of research on this, it will like leave you incandescent with rage of what is happening. And because we struggle to talk about it, some of this stuff may be quite new to you. So where I used to work, you've got, as well as holidays, you've got volunteer days. I know more and more places are doing this now as part of CSR. And you could go to a charity and kind of help out a little bit. So this was a sexual health charity in Manchester that dealt mostly with sex workers. And what this board is for is we kind of hung out and helped for the day, and we saw people go up and they would stick notices on the board. And essentially what it is descriptions that sex workers have seen of dangerous Johns. So they may have been attacked by these individuals, or they know someone who's attacked by them, or they've seen someone and their experience has thought, oh Jesus, like that feels weird or odd. So they stick it on this board, or the charity would stick it on the board after a report is filled out. And the plan is that other sex workers would come in, would look at the board, memorize it, and then be a little bit safer because they've got a description of this. And it's wonderful that these things exist, but you can see how many flaws there are with that. That this is happening way after, I mean, it's laminated, it's happening way after the fact. That person will be dressed differently, potentially in a different place. How do you remember all of that? How do you pass it on to everybody else? So we knew there had to be a better way of doing this. With digital, that was kind of what we did. We would tackle problems like this with digital. Obviously, me knowing nothing about sex work, the worst possible scenario is that I design a solution and just like, here you go, I fixed it, everyone's safe now, no more newspaper reports. So what we did, we partnered with a few charities who are experts in this, who have networks of sex workers. And the reason why I think this comes into Taboo was how difficult it is to have these conversations or to find your target audience. At the case in point, we wanted to do what all UX designers do. Let's do a workshop, and we've got post-its ready. We can't afford a day rate. We're not like a fancy agency. We work with charities. Like, we could not afford a day rate of a lot of sex workers. Like, even donuts can't tempt you to come in. So we had to partner with the charities and go out to the sex workers. So that was into the brothels and under the bridges, and went to, one of my colleagues went to a sex worker conference in Brazil, which is more sex worker for people conference for people who know about sex workers rather than sex workers going to a conference together. Does that make sense? I mean, there were some instances of that, but yeah, that was kind of how that worked. So that was kind of fascinating. I'm going to tell you a few examples of why that was really helpful, but first I'll tell you broadly what the app does. I'm not allowed to tell you the name of the app, which I'll tell you about later. And this is like weird shape, but this isn't what it looks like, but it's what it does, broadly speaking. So the charities that we partnered with, so what this project showed was that everything you would guess about sex workers, unless you know about sex workers, would be wrong. My first thought when I heard about this project is the same thought I would have about homelessness as well, to some extent, is access to mobile phones is going to be really, really rare. The charities that we partnered with, they had digital networks with sex workers who did have mobile phones. It was very rare that they didn't. Now, the type of mobile phone changed depending on where you were on the affluence line. If you were a street worker, you would have like the lowest end Android phone. It's not like a diss on Android, by the way. Or maybe like an iPhone 4S now. But if you were higher up that chain, so you were an independent escort, yeah, and you would be in maybe your own apartment, you're more likely to have like a Pixel phone or an iPhone X or 10, as it's meant to be called. But they did have phones, so technically, basically what the app does is you see someone who you think is dodgy, so previously it would have been a dodgy punters board, you put in a description, you hit the send alert button, and it pings it out to all the sex workers nearby, using GPS to show roughly where this was. Now there's a whole load of really interesting but also dull stuff that I don't fully understand around the privacy settings of that, because privacy was one of the massive concerns of this. And I'll come back to some of the interesting features around it, around why meeting with the sex workers, speaking with them, and like reasonably well-to-do posh designers in Manchester getting over the issues that they have with working in a field like this. So you're actually open to listen and be a human being, was quite interesting. But it's where taboo was an issue here, because by its very nature, it means user research is potentially going to be difficult in terms of getting people to be honest and open up and speak to you, as well as finding the right sorts of people. So the question we had in our mind was, how do we engage with such a disenfranchised audience, the people that you don't like, I mean the royal you, I include me in this, rather than me getting up here and just yelling at everybody. The people that we don't like to think about, or the people that it's easier to not think about, or not fully understand their concerns and difficulties. How do we get reliable results there? So I'll give you an example. I came in to the company midway through this project, and the initial iteration of the design, from a brand background, a really good designer can sell anything, even if it's nonsense. You'll have seen those absolutely terrible logos everywhere. And if you've worked in brand or you've worked in visual design, you can imagine a designer in a room selling that as the best thing in the world and people just eating it up. So the initial design, it totally made sense if you don't know anything about sex work. The idea was, maybe you've been assaulted and you've got to a safe place and you're using this app. It was a really calming experience. The language was really gentle, the screen was really, really light, it was a relaxed, I mean, it's not gonna like fix you, it's not gonna like calm you down, it's gonna be more supportive. And okay, let's take it out and test it. We took it out and tested it, and higher up that affluence line, reasonably positive response. It's when you get to the sex workers who work on the street that they're like, this will kill me because I'm probably hiding in an alleyway in the dark and this screen is going to light me up, it's going to expose me. Also, depending on the region, English language was an issue and the budget was so small, multilingual support was quite difficult. So this led to a shift towards iconography as much as possible to back that up. And it was like frightening as soon as you discovered that issue. That what if we'd not been able to find a charity, what if we didn't bother to find a charity, what if we'd not gone out and met the sex workers? Here we come in on our like white horse trying to solve a problem and you end up killing someone is like terrifying. And because of the taboo nature of this, would you even know it was you that had done it? Would you even know this person had used your app? So that like absolutely frightened everybody. Everybody was absolutely terrifying. But there was some interesting results at it. So we piloted it in Manchester, then we piloted it in London, and it is now out there. The reason we're not allowed to use the name is, again, from the interviews with the sex workers, we knew that for reasons that are nobody's business. A lot of their family may not know what they do. And there was a scenario we discussed that seems really rare, but you were in meetings with the design team, And it was really common to hear someone say, and it was like quite shocking, for this is the first project I'd worked on in this company, oh no, if we do that, someone might die. You're like, okay, this is very different from like designing for gambling products, where it was, oh yeah, someone might die and we'll lose some money there. Yeah, so that was quite terrifying. An example of how the app was used, where we got some anecdotal feedback of what had worked, was a really, really strange scenario that had been, to some extent, considered. And it was, because the data we collect to say why we're using anecdotal evidence here has to be so limited and careful and locked down in terms of usage. The stories that we hear around success are usually word of mouth from the charities or the sex workers have told us. One of the difficulties getting people to use it, of course, was that promise of anonymity. That's why the name of the app, nobody knows. There's a few people inside the company who know the real name, so we have a PR name that we would use sometimes. Basically, it's a secretive lockdown app, which I'll go into a little bit. But the story of where it had worked in a strange scenario was what the app was not to be used for. This was not a call for help, like a distress button. That's what 999 is for. This app is not an efficient way to get help. But the story I've heard is there was a sex worker who English was not her first language, and this is where we're unsure. She was either deaf or mute, and had locked herself in the bathroom because she was being attacked, and the story suggests that death was a very likely scenario, and she was unable to make a phone call. So she used the app to ping out for help, and help came. And we were like, the designer who had particularly worked on it was like horrified by, I mean, like it had worked for that, but she was horrified. She's like, yeah, we kind of considered stories like that. We use Sarah Wachter-Botch, I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with her work. She uses this term called stress cases. And we use it similarly, but we refer to them as crisis cases. So these are edge cases that in a commercial setting we would maybe dismiss because it's such a small percentage of our user base that we would probably not cater for it, particularly with such a small budget. But when you're designing in for vulnerable people like this, we need to be trying to map out and predict as many of those as possible, because it might only be one person, but the result doesn't affect our budget line. It results in someone dying, hence the death in the title. And another example where we had to consider for that was how private the app had to be. Because as I was saying, where you may not know that your family member may not know what you do, one of the crisis cases we discussed with the charities was we presented, the way it worked was quite strange. We would basically present them with just like batshit scenarios, like, could this happen? They'd be like, no, that wouldn't happen. We're like, okay, and then we try something else, like, no, and then, oh yeah, maybe that would happen. So this was one of the scenarios. It would be, you were a sex worker and you're no longer a sex worker, but you're with a partner who was with you when you were a sex worker. So that partner is familiar with sex work, is also abusive, and is familiar with the charity that you work with, the charity that works with sex workers. Like, does everyone understand that scenario? Okay, so if you had gone back to sex work and not told your partner, and if that partner found out, there's a chance that partner would attack you. Everyone with me so far? Okay, so the danger in this scenario is, what if they see the app on your phone? Because again, another question we asked, in that scenario, is it likely that that abusive partner would access your phone without your permission, or not care about your permission, would just do that? And they were like, yes, that's possible. So we had to make an app that was easy to use, but that was not remotely noticeable that that's what it was. And from a brand background, it was like weird to create a fake brand, because it has to look like something that is just played. You know, if anyone made an app where when you're making the app icon, you consider color and contrast. Like, how do we make this stand out from other apps? You want to be on the home screen. You're not going to be on the home screen. Don't make apps. No one uses apps anymore. But you want to make an app. You want to make sure it's on the home screen, and you want to make sure that people notice it's in a place where they can click. We needed to make an app that was really easy to reach and use, but that if someone else accessed the phone, in no scenario would they be interested in it. That was the goal. And when you click, if they did tap the button, it opens up to a fake home screen that a login is required, and in no way does it give away what it is. Obviously, there are limitations there around what is possible at that stage, but it's taking the best possible route that we can. Another really important feature that had to be in there was notifications, being able to turn them on or off. Again, if you're familiar with making apps, these are the things that you normally hide. You ask for permission first because you want access to that, but then to turn them off, you want to make that a little bit difficult. Because if it's a money-making app, notifications are going to be part of your bread and butter. This, if we can go back, this isn't the final thing, but you can see there's the I need help button, and there is also, let's see what other people have said is nearby that's dangerous. Then after that is push notifications, because the scenario for this is, sorry, this is going to keep going again. What if you come home to that situation? Your urgent thing right now is you need to make sure you're not going to get a push notification on your phone, say, you know, there's a dodgy person nearby, watch out, sex workers. So this was terrifying. This was terrifying for me. First off, how do you engage with this audience? How do you get them to open up to you and to be frank and honest when their natural gut reaction is not to trust you? How do you do that? How do you make sure that the thing that you've made you test in a suitable way that is going to get you fair results? Because we're presumably most of us are familiar with usability testing and how easy it is to game that so you get like a positive result. The checks and balances, making sure that that work is ethical and valid, is terrifying. We had a similar situation where we made a chatbot with Childline and the Children's Commission. That was I can't really talk about that at all, other than it is a chatbot to help triage children who are at risk of abuse online, is essentially how that works. That was just absolutely terrifying and horrifying. These projects have ruined my search engine history forever, basically. If ever my mum wants to use my laptop, it's like, just wait a minute, I'll delete stuff. Okay, onto something just as fun. Sexually transmitted infections. So who doesn't love to talk about gonorrhea, right? This is whenever I've been on first dates, this is the slide deck I take them through as well. Yeah, I'm married, I don't go on dates now, just to clarify. Yeah, so I guess another important thing to consider as well around the difficulty of getting sex workers to talk to you and communicate you as well was that in some ways there is a sex worker community. The Dodgy Punters board showed that, and the usage of the app shows that. But there also isn't as well, in terms of their primary concern, understandably, is self-preservation. So how do you also encourage people to send alerts just as much as they're going to check out what is safe nearby? How do you encourage that sense of looking out for one another when that is your day-to-day life, particularly low down the affluent scale? That understandably isn't your concern. There was also really difficult conversations and things we had to consider, which the reason I'm pausing is I find it difficult to talk about these things as well in terms of not sounding glib and not saying something that is going to give the wrong impression. Okay, so this is a sensitive thing to talk about, and please forgive me if I explain this poorly. So there were various phases of the app. The first phase of the reporting was basically not to put limitations on it, tell us what happened, what the person looks like, but very little direction, because of the English language problem was part of it, and to not force people down a certain route. However, there were then legal implications of if this did go to court and the sex worker did want to make a statement or press charges, this, as a piece of evidence, we had to be careful that it had to be structured in a certain way that made sense. So then it got to the stage of how do we categorize, which is deliberately, for the purpose of this, clinical term, what happened. Okay, so examples of what would be on this would be rape, assault, theft, those kind of things. And the initial copy was provided by the charity. And for us as an agency, the phrasing of that felt just really cold. Like the idea of someone having to tick a box and say rape just felt like the opposite of passionate, if that makes sense. Compassionate, the opposite of that. And what the horrible part of that conversation was, so you know when you're preparing for a client call, this is a partnership, not a client call, but as a designer, when you're preparing, you know when you're like preparing for a fight, where you know this is going to be something you feel you need to push back on. So you try and get the evidence that you can to support your case and have a conversation where you're informed, but you feel you can sway them in an ethical way, of course. But obviously they know this much better than us. That's why we partner with them. And one of the shocking stories of that was to a sex worker, low down the affluence scale. The most difficult thing to tick in that box is not rape, it's theft. That's the thing they're going to be most shook up by, which is just like, we were like, Jesus, like just the thought of that is just horrifying and upsetting and not easy to understand. And I still don't fully grasp that, but it was because rape is really common for them. Again, a horrible term to use, so forgive me on that. But the theft thing is going to really, really affect them on top of everything else. The loss of property is going to be really, really difficult for them. So you're like, how do you wrap your head around that? How do you encourage those, how do you look these people in the eye and encourage conversations and just not come across like what I am, which is someone who is just fully out of their depth in this conversation, was interesting again, but not in a grim way. This project is slightly more fun and not more interesting, it's probably less interesting, but it's more fun and is less likely to make me cry. So this was work we did for a sexual health hub that was a healthcare service of sorts, where you could go to this website if you thought you might have gonorrhea and you can get a postal test, for example, or you might think, oh, there's something a bit wrong with my pee, and you go to this website and you'll like look it up and it'll say, yeah, you need to do this, or no. It was like an online triaging system to work out, do you need an appointment? Some of the really interesting stuff around that was the gender question, which is, that in itself is something that we all need to be more informed of. This was not referring, what made this interesting and difficult was this was not referring to identity, this was referring to sex. So essentially what they needed to know was, what bits do you have? Which was an interesting way, how do we deal with that? So the research that we did with a variety of communities and individuals to try and make sure to what extent do we A, meet the healthcare requirements, B, also not be massive asshats with how we deal with that question. And I think there's still more work to be done on that, both in the work that we did, but also the work that everybody does. Because in most cases, why are you asking gender? Do you really need it? No is usually the answer. But in this case, we needed to know the sex. But what was quite interesting was language here. So the approach that this organisation had taken in the past was they thought, we're going to target at-risk young people who don't know much about sexual health. We're going to educate them and also help them get help. Help them get help. What wonderful language. So the initial approach they had taken was, hey, I'm not 40, I'm slightly younger than that. Hey, I'm a 40-year-old guy, I know how young people speak, I'm going to come up with the terms that we use. That was the approach that they'd taken, and it was just like nonsense. Like, the terminology I used was just against all research around how you actually speak to young people. The way you speak to young people is the way that you speak to people, because young people are people. And they'd got that wrong. They were all... the reason why I like this slide in particular is the illustrator in my team there was this wonderful guy called Alex. He's from Transylvania, so I know someone from Transylvania, which is amazing. And he's a wonderful illustrator, and essentially he had to come up with loads of illustrations and iconography for a variety of sexually transmitted infections, which was just the best brief to give him, because he was like, really, no, I don't know, no sex, no sexual transmitted infections. Like, oh yay. So I had him doing this, like, his budget was free, so I had him doing it much longer than we had to, just because it was fun making him do it. So sometimes I send him photos of the sketches he'd done just to remind him on like a daily basis, hey Alex, remember when you did gonorrhea? But the reason why this was important though, so here's what the site had to do. If you thought you had a sexually transmitted infection, you could come to the website, it would triage you could book an appointment, it could do that. Also, if you needed sexual health information, you could come to the website, read about it, or watch a video about it. It would help you there. Had to do those things, so that's like reasonably straightforward stuff. The triaging stuff was a complicated nightmare to make that simple, but there was that. what they'd not necessarily considered was those crisis cases. So the site we redesigned, so what it used to be like, was aimed purely at those young people. For some inexplicable reason, the website was completely red. And they had anthropomorphic condoms and fun little characters that were illustrated, and they had knickers on it that would spin if you'd hover your mouse over it. And there was an illustration of condoms with faces riding a boat along this sea of blood. It's horrendous, absolutely horrific. And they were open to changing that, which was good. A band title, Anthropomorphic Condoms Riding a Boat up a Sea of Blood. Me and my friend have a spreadsheet of that. But what the other cases the website had to cope for was if you're a 13-year-old girl who has been raped and you're not ready to tell anyone and you come to the website for anonymous help. Crisis case, really rare. But can you imagine coming into a website that's red and his knickers spinning? But they were really keen on the idea of illustrations and iconography that were calming but also gentle. And those cases have happened since the website has launched. It wasn't an imaginary thing we made up. So it was important that we get that right. I feel that we did. It has been successful. I don't have time for it, but the fun stories as well of the tree test we did for the IA, where I, as just a really awkward person, had to get people to say, okay, you need to check for signs of cancer on your testicles, what would you do? And I said the word testicles more than I've ever said in my life. That in this sentence is more than I'd previously said it. So that was fun. But essentially, the one takeaway is, be a human. We say as designers that we care about users, that we're user-centered. But what does that actually mean if we remove conversion, if that isn't what we care about? What if we remove success in terms of the organizational goal, which might be budget? What harm could we do if we get it wrong? And it feels like, obviously I've talked about quite extreme cases where you're making a website for sex workers, or you're doing a chatbot for children who are at risk of abuse. But take mainstream example, which everyone's talking about, so I'm not going into it, but Twitter. That's not an extreme case of something designed to focus on vulnerable people, but think of the harm that that product has done. It's done wonderful good as well, so I'm not on a Twitter is evil, but think of the harm that that has done, because caring about users was about conversion, not about stopping nuclear war on Nazis or sexual threats and rape attacks and death threats. The care about users, I think, needs to be more than caring about the bottom line, I think, is what I want to take away. I didn't end on a fun note. Have I got anything fun to say? No, don't be asshats, basically. So, thank you.
You talked about the stress cases that you used for certain design decisions. How did you come up with those?
Not really that much of an interesting technique, really. So you might map out user stories. We tried a variety of things of brainstorming exercises to come up with what could possibly go wrong. So when we're doing, for example, a service blueprint of what the service is being offered, which would usually, with the work we do, would involve offline interaction. So we're mapping out all the touch points that the individual might have with the product in the loosest sense. In those scenarios, what is likely to happen, but also what is the worst case scenario that could possibly happen in that moment. So it's painstaking, but it's quite an interesting exercise to do as well. It's always really, really helpful to do that with experts from the field that you're working in, and with users as well. Does that help? I know it's not like here's an exercise to do.
How do you find a job that is in a positive social impact sort of job? I mean, that's not something you can search for, is it?
No, it's not. It's not easy. So the reason why I moved was partly selfish, which was career development. This is a much bigger role, but I was interested in going in-house. So the agency approach meant that you work on a problem, and then if that client doesn't come back, how do you know how that's gone? So the idea of sticking around was quite interesting. What I would say is, I don't think the answer is every designer to move to an organisation that does just that, because then there's no designers in other organisations that care, if that makes sense. But there are more and more agencies who are working towards ethical design or ethical tech. So I think a lot of it is look at more than trying to find an agency like that. It's really scrutinise the work that the agency's done in the past and their mission statement, and go to an interview and you interview them, like grill the shit out of them around what do you care about, why do you do this, what are you interested in, what impact have you made. And if you get shrugs, it's like maybe a red flag is probably the best way. But it is more and more. In Manchester, there's 3 agencies already who just focus solely on this. So it is more of a thing now.
Any more questions?
Yeah.
Random question. Did you have any difficulty getting on the App Store?
Yes. Thankfully, yes. We really did. Because it's user-generated content. And they will mention sex and rape a lot, understandably. So we worked with Apple quite closely on how it would work to get on there. So on the Play Store, you can put anything on there. Yeah, it was a challenge to get on the App Store, but we did do it by working quite closely with them. I think the first version was rejected, but yeah, there's just one up there. Just while the mic goes around. Also, there is a technique that, in terms of working out stress cases, which I've been working on for a while now. It's called a red team exercise. So I've not made up the exercise. This happens in journalism and in the army. My dad's like an army man. Essentially, when you make a new product, the blue team is the team who's worked on the product. So this is your team of experts, researchers, designers, developers, project managers. And you create, this isn't always possible depending on the size of your agency. You create a red team, equal expertise, who know nothing about the project. That's difficult sometimes, but you want to try and keep them sheltered for it. And then you bring in at crucial points a day where the blue team presents to the red team, and it's moderated. And the red team's job is to go to war with them and try and break them and tell them how they're going to ruin the world. And that's a really fun meeting to be in. Everyone hates each other for a little bit, but that is the way that I combat it now.
I was just going to ask something you probably can't go into too much detail about, but I'll ask anyways, the balance between wanting people who are at risk to be able to use these tools, but at the same time being careful how to promote them and keeping them under wraps. So you can't, presumably, there are ways of having them not listed in the App Store, for example, and you only give the charities the way of promoting them, but sooner or later, word of mouth and the success of them might go against you?
Yes, which was a concern, particularly with the sex worker app, not so much with the other stuff. It's more NDA why I can't really talk about those. The sex worker app, you have to put in a certain phrase or keywords to even find the app. And the only way to get on that app is you need to be a registered member of that charity, and they will give you access to it. So even if you stumble across it on the App Store, it's impossible to know what it does. And you can download it, but you can't remotely access it. I mean, access it obviously remotely. I don't mean in the technical term. You can't access it without permission from the charity. So yeah.
I'm curious about sort of how you onboarded users. I know you mentioned that if you opened it up, you would get a homepage or like a login that would essentially pretend that it wasn't the app. So for people that actually were using the app for like the real purposes, how did you kind of explain that that was what they were looking at and how to actually use it?
It's a good question, and it's something that, as it moves further afield and abroad, I think really needs to be nailed down. The short-term solution, because it's been piloted in cities with the charity's help, has been we've done training sessions with their audience on how to use the app, because we're in that rare position where it isn't that someone can hear about it, download it and use it. They need to have that connection in order to get on it. So we've been fortunate enough that we are able to provide that training. Hopefully as it grows with scale, and there are, like Nevada was interested in using it, I'm sure other councils will be, there does need to be a plan in place for what can we do that enables it to grow and reach more people, where it isn't, because obviously at the minute it's shackled by that connection with the charity, which is a good thing, but it is also restrictive in how it can grow. So how do we solve that so it isn't constrained to that extent, but it doesn't also lose the safety of that, is an interesting thing to consider. And then how do we onboard people if they can just access it? Thank you very much.